45 was involved in. Roswell was one of them. Clearly indicating that they had the file. I personally have seen some of that information. What happened in July 1947 here in Roswell was in fact the crash of 2 or more unidentified flying objects, which later were not to be unidentified. We positively confirmed that they were interplanetary craft from some other place within our solar or within our galaxy. They did not originate in our solar system, complete with bodies. We recovered the debris. We recovered whole craft. They have reverence for their dead. I can tell you that we did not maintain for too awful long possession of the bodies. In one instance, there were 5 entities. 3 were dead. 1 was seriously injured that died later as a result of its injuries. 1 wasn't all that bad as far as its injuries went. I cannot confirm whether it was returned alive or dead. I do know that we had a problem because medication, as we understand it, doesn't work for them. Food that we eat that may be healthy for us was poisonous to them. So synthetics had to be applied. And how that went about, I don't know, because I wasn't in a position to have a need to know. What I'm stating right here, I know for a fact to be true, simply because I lived it, I worked with it. But I'm really getting ahead of myself.
And I got to see the book.
Prior to the age of 4, I lived a normal life like any other kid. The events that led up to even me getting in the military started around about that time. At the age of 4, I had a situation where it's hard to recall, and a lot of what I'm about to state is going to be hard to recall. I never made notes. I never kept notes. The intent was to take everything to the grave with me. Upon completion of all the recording, I'll explain why I'm talking now. You have to have a tragedy in your life before you start talking about this stuff. And that's why I started to talk. But I want to get to that at the end. The situation is that with what happened at the age of 4, it was Christmas. And during Christmas, I was looking forward, I believed in Santa Claus at that time, for the arrival of Santa Claus. It was very hard to sleep. I remember going to bed, but then getting up, waiting for Santa Claus. Since we didn't have a fireplace, I wanted to see how he's going to get in. There was a tap at the door, and my mom and dad told me that that was Santa Claus. I immediately went up to my room and tried to act like I was asleep. I remember someone dressed in a Santa Claus suit coming up to look at me, try to see if I was asleep. I remember opening one eye to see if that person was still there. And I thought, I'm not going to get anything this year because Santa Claus knows I'm awake. Santa Claus left. I stayed there in bed, dying to get up to see what was left under the tree for me. About an hour passed, no one came for me, and I knew my mom and dad was going to go out to some Christmas party. So I laid there. One of my half-sisters was to take care of me. And I've always identified the woman who came up to my bed long about an hour after my family was gone, it was quiet, as being my half-sister, although she had no recollection of it. But the person came up, as opposed to saying, well, let's go down and see what's under the tree for you, ask a very strange question. Would you like to see the boogeyman? Well, I didn't believe in a boogeyman. But yeah, that sounded like it'd be something interesting to see. Now, we lived on Stanton Avenue at the time, the corner house on Stanton Avenue. The steel mill was there, and it was very active at that time. They had 3 shifts. They had the day shift, the prime shift, and the graveyard shift. I know that this was after 11 o'clock when this event took place. But this lady took me down, took me out to the back porch, and we stood there. Finally, I heard a rumble, very much like a caterpillar, a tractor with a grader on front, Looking around, I saw that it was a Caterpillar. And it was just a man driving it down the street. They're very unusual because we didn't have this happen there, particularly after 11 o'clock at night. As the vehicle got closer, still being a Caterpillar, I noticed the driver of the Caterpillar. Then I noticed that his eyes wasn't like ours, but they were a glowing red. He seemed to have like a business suit on, with the vest and the hat with the brim all the way around it. But it was one solid color. A darkish brown, as though somebody had just picked up a big, large clunk of dirt and carved away at making this person. I stood back, became a little frightened, particularly as the Caterpillar passed by. The person looked over at us, looked down at us, and all I could see at that time was the glowing red eyes. Now I was told, well, now you need to go to bed. So I went to bed. I didn't get up the rest of the night. I did go to sleep, wondering about what I saw. The next morning it was far removed from my mind. It was far removed from my mind simply because what had taken place there was the night before. It may have no meaning at all, and it was Christmas Day, and I got a lot of nice things that day. But I'd find myself wandering back to that. Within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks later, I was talking about that event to my cousin, well, both my cousins, Larry Stevens and Herbie Stevens, telling them about it. A friend of mine was there by the name of Delbert Hudson. We were talking about it, and of course they thought, no, this just had to be a dream. Then we started to hear a rumble like a freight train coming from the sky. We looked up. There were 3 very large, about the size of a grapefruit, held at arm's length, dancing in the sky.
Lights.
They were kind of yellowish in color, was not beaming down a beam of light or anything like that. They just shone, once again, very, very large, as I said, like a grapefruit held at arm's length. But they were just dancing around like this, floating around one another. They would sometimes come down closer, then go back up. We watched that until our mothers called us in. My mom, she saw it. Herbie and Larry's mother, she also saw it, but we didn't pay much attention to it at that time. We really wasn't into UFOs. The events leading up after that, we moved to a place on Rhodes Avenue. It was a small cottage. At this time, I had had quite a few experiences with things that I always identified as children that no one else could see. I normally thought it was quite normal for people to have this, but I also found that it made me a laughing stock. But I could not bring myself to state I didn't see these people, that it wasn't a real event. People were trying to tell me, well, it's just overactive imagination. Once we moved into the house on Rhodes Avenue, me and some of my friends were out playing. We were playing Cowboys and Indians. We were playing in my backyard. All of a sudden, we heard some very strange, like music being played. Behind our house was another was an alley, and another row of houses on Gallia Street. Behind it was a hill. On top of the hill, there was a rock that was painted white. We called it White Rock, roughly 200, 250 feet high. But from my vantage point, we looked up on the hill, and there we saw what I had the impression of was 5 or 6 people running around in white coveralls. Now, there's no way I can know this for a fact, but I had the impression that they had white baseball caps on. No way of knowing that, but they had a white cover on their head. This was easily ascertainable. We looked up there in amazement, thought, well, maybe it's just some kids up there, but what are they doing all dressed the same? We played for a little while, still looking from time to time up on the hill. Then all of a sudden, maybe 5-10 minutes after we watched these 4 or 5 figures up there, they were standing all in a line. 2 or 3 on one side, 2 or 3 on the other side. In the middle about 2 to 3 times taller than these that were in the white coveralls, was a metallic individual, glistening in the sun as a bright sunlit day. Once again, the music started to play. And I'm not ashamed to admit it, as a kid of maybe 6, 7 years old at the time, I was afraid. I called to my friends and told them to run and hide. I ran and hid. I ran into the house, hid behind the stove. And there I felt like bony fingers just going on the top of my head. I had the impression that this was showing me that I couldn't run and hide from this. That I could run, I could hide, but they'd always know where I was at. I told my mom and dad about this. Later on that night, I had dark figures, shadows is the best way to put it, that came into my room. Being frightened, I went and asked my dad if I could sleep there with him. So I slept that night there. But here again, the dark shadows followed me there. The next night, after this event occurred, up on top of the hill, very bright, yellowish light shining down from this very point where we saw those entities. My Aunt Doll, my mom, Olive Stone, my sister, and myself watched these for several hours from the bathroom window, which the bathroom window showed you could see directly up on top of the hill. We went to bed with the light show still ongoing. Got up the next morning, nothing was there. Everything went normal after that within my life, except for the visitations of what I identified as children who came to work, even helped me with my homework. For roughly a year. By this time, we had moved to another location. We moved to 1906 Northmoreland Avenue. There, everything seemed to be pretty good for about a year. I started second grade there. One night, while I was fast asleep, didn't hear the fall or anything, my aunt fell. She was upstairs. She was in her room getting ready to go to bed. She laid up there. The doctor came and saw her. She stayed there for about a day. Then the doctor decided her condition was worsening. They needed to take her to the hospital. They took her to the Mercy Hospital there in Portsmouth, Ohio. She died within a couple of days of being in the hospital. Everything seemed normal until one night, about a month or two after her death. We were watching Craft Mystery Theater. It dealt with a town being flooded and people being trapped in a house in the flood. I remember that vividly. My mom, my sister, and myself was there. My mom was sitting in a chair. My sister was lying on the couch. I was lying in front of the TV on the floor. We all of a sudden heard a crash. My mother was later to tell me it sounded just like the night that Aunt Doll fell. Anyhow, my sister and I jumped up, was running toward our mom. My mom picked us up, and we were now running out of the house. As we ran out of the house, our neighbors across the street was running toward us. We met right there in the center of the street. The people told us that they saw a light on up in my Aunt Doll's room and saw a shadow, as though it was my Aunt Doll, which they were accustomed to, because she had like a sand brown colored blind, and she'd pull that down at night and sit there by her rock in her rocker and rock. The night that she died, she did the same thing. Anyhow, the people saw what appeared to be her getting up and falling, and then the lights went out. This was very reminiscent of the night that she had her fall that ultimately led to her death. We went back into the house, and one woman from across the street told her husband, "Why don't you go on upstairs and we'll follow you to see what's going on?" Well, they were stating no, they wasn't going to do this. Well, there was a girl that I know that I hung around with a lot at that time, and her name was Bonnie Moore. I got a big stick, and she and I decided that we would go up to try to find out what happened up there, what made the noise. So we went up. We could find nothing at all that could explain the noise. Everything was in its place as the day when they took my aunt to the hospital. Nothing had changed. started talking about it being a token or an omen. But we were never able to ascertain what that was.
After she and I started to go up the stairs?
Nothing very much happened after that, except you could hear my aunt from time to time, a disembodied voice where she would call to my mother, like calling Holly. You would hear footsteps upstairs in the room and no one was there. My dad didn't believe in anything like this could take place. Then one night he had an event. With him having that event, within a matter of 2 weeks, we got us another place. Ironically, this was 1906 11th Street. We moved there. I continued with the 2nd grade, went into the summer. During the summer, not very many events happened. But then one summer while I was going, or the summer of 1957, while I was going to go play a game of baseball with a friend of mine, a guy by the name of Michael Eubanks, I went to his house roughly 10 o'clock in the morning to try to see if he was up and if he was ready to play a game of ball. As I was knocking on his door and calling his name from his back door, he had his yard, of course, in the back. Behind his yard was an alley. Behind the alley, on the other side of the alley, was a very large, about 4 or 5 story storage building. I heard a whirling sound, like the high-pitch sound that a electrical generator makes. I looked around to try to find where that sound was coming from. As I looked over the storage building, there was a small white opaque disc with an inner ring and an outer ring. The inner ring was going clockwise, the outer ring was going counterclockwise. I watched it as it came over the building and very gracefully glided over his house. I ran around to the front to see if I could see anything. It was no longer in my vision. I looked across the street. I was well aware that other people across the street had seen something. They were looking into the sky. I ran home to tell my mom and dad what I saw. They went ahead, oh, it's just an overactive imagination. Some of the people across the street told my dad what they had seen, but still he wanted to downplay it. He did not want to believe I saw anything. He didn't want me to look crazy because I'd already started to talk about these things that were taking place. With that event, something very unusual started to come into my life. At nights, I would wake up with a fear that I cannot describe. I spent 4 years in Vietnam. I saw combat while I was in Vietnam. And I know that fear. I don't know of any other fear that could surmount that. But this fear was even greater than that. What I saw was, I guess you could state, was along the lines of what they refer to as the old hag phenomenon. And that is, you would wake up in the middle of the night with a fear that you couldn't explain even why you had the fear. But you were wide awake. You would see the figure of a dark entity or dark object roughly about on your chest. You couldn't move. A lot of times my head would be to my left like this, or to my right rather like this. And through the corner of my eye, I could catch a glimpse of it. I was fighting for all that I had in me to break free of whatever was holding me down. Eventually, you would be free, but you couldn't go back to sleep. You would have this cold sweat, and you would have this unreasonable fear. Whatever was there could still be there. In all probability was there, but you couldn't see it. And I had several episodes with this. Later, I would find that it wasn't just a paralysis that occurred at night. One night I got to see the face of the entity, and it was a real pale gray, very much like the storybook witch that you would see, like, say, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the long pointy nose. Even the cackling laugh was there. And I mentioned the cackling laugh because the only time I heard that was one day when I was playing hide and seek. I was playing hide and seek in the house because it was raining on the outside with my sister. I hid behind the couch because it was set catacording and there was a place you could get behind it. Once once I hid behind there, I looked up to see if my sister was coming. We had one of these grand pianos on the side as you entered the living room. As I looked up, peeping out from behind that grand piano was this creature that I had seen many times at night. This was the first time I saw it during the day. And looked out at me and just had this hellish laugh. Well, I immediately jumped out from where I was hiding and ran into the kitchen, once again wanting to hide. My mom was in the hospital at this time. My Aunt Lynn was taking care of us. Now, my Aunt Lynn hated me after that day because my aunt tried to set me in a chair in the kitchen and make me sit there. I didn't want to sit there. I needed to run and hide. I had to sit there. When my mom got out of the hospital, then I started crying, begging my mom and dad to take me to see a doctor, because the doctor could make the monsters go away. I didn't want to see what I was seeing, yet I was doomed to see these things. I didn't know who to talk to because no one was listening. And then one day, still 1957, still the summer, I go up to Kelso's Drugs. That's the drug store that was on the corner there on 11th Street. I run into an Air Force officer, Air Force uniform, captain. I'm trying to buy a copy of the book, magazine that came out on UFOs. It was released by True Magazine. It was a True Magazine special. But by virtue of True Magazine being identified as a men's magazine, I couldn't buy it. I was too young. So, not being able to buy it, arguing with the cashier there that I should be able. It's only about UFOs. It has nothing else in there. But yet he was not going to let me buy it because it was a men's magazine. Captain Brown stepped up behind me and says, "You have an interest in UFOs too?" I looked up, saw he was the captain. I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, so do I." So he went over, got another copy. He says, "I'll take 2 of these magazines." So he bought 2. We went over after that, and he says, sat down at a booth there. He says, "Do you like root beer floats?" I'd never had a root beer float. Personally, I didn't think I'd ever like it. Root beer is okay by itself. Ice cream is okay by itself, but not mixed in the same glass. Anyhow, he got us 2 root beer floats. He says, "You don't have to drink it if you don't like it." So I found out that I like root beer floats. I also felt good because here was a person in uniform, a captain nonetheless, in the Air Force, who was listening intently to what I had to say about the events that had happened in my life, who was able to understand that there was a fear element there, but he was trying to reassure me I had nothing to be afraid of. Then, when we got up to leave, he says, "Well, I got one of these magazines for you, but I have to check with your parents first to see if it's okay if you can have this." We went on to my home. He introduced himself to my mother, talked to my mom. When my dad got home from work, talked to him. And he was trying to make him understand that while there was no evidence that UFOs exist, there were strange things happening. And that I may have a key to certain information that they don't fully understand. So we became very good friends. From that time on, Captain Brown would remain a captain, which I wouldn't know until after I got into the military for far too long as a captain. Prior to me getting into the military, allegedly Captain Brown was killed in the crash of a T-33. From this event there, I started to see these little creatures, which looked very human to me, looked very much like little children. I identified them as my playmates. Then an event took place where I always had a love of animals. The girl I mentioned earlier, Bonnie Moore, and myself, we'd go through a wooded area out in back of her place, find insects, animals, and try to nurse them back to health if they were injured. We didn't know that insects were supposed to be something bad, that people wasn't supposed to like grasshoppers. But we had always tried to find little birds that needed help, sparrows, pigeons, even some of the wildlife that was in the creek there. Once we got them back to where they seemed like they could be on their own, we'd then go ahead and release them. Anyhow, while we were living there on 11th Street, I found this little bird, fell out of its nest, and I tried to go ahead and nurse it back to life. It had its beak broke, and it was screaming. I can assume it was in a lot of pain. But as a child, you're taught if you have a cut, what you do is go and hold it underwater. I took the bird, it was bleeding from the beak, I held it under the water, and I drowned it. Now, at that time, I was always taught grown men don't cry. One of the virtues you didn't have, being a male species, was the right to express emotion. You were not to feel these things. It was just a bird. I found myself thinking about its mom and dad missing it. What a terrible thing I had done. I had killed this little bird. One of the creatures that I always identified as a little child because they looked human, now I got to see for the first time what it really looked like. Unfortunately, I had a person come here who was an artist for the Denver Mint, or the Franklin Mint, and he drew a picture of it and sent it to me based on the description I gave to him. I saw my little creature now for the first time as it really looked. First I was taken back, but I can't say I was really afraid because I was used to knowing this creature.
How old were you here?
And immediately the questions started to come into my head.
Part of the story.
Very, very rapidly, very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Why was I feeling remorse? Why did I have waters in my eyes, killing a smaller version of an animal that we even used as food? Why did I have these emotions? The entity even told me he could feel the emotions that I felt. From that day on, I would have, at his pleasure, interaction with this entity, who would later tell me that his name was Corona, spelled with a K. Or Corona spelled with a C. I could never, ever understand
because I know it's being
why these events took place.
And at that time, I did not want to.
But now, more and more events was taking place. I was seeing more and more UFOs. I was having more and more interaction with entities, not just Corona, but others, but looked very human to me.
The night before.
And here again, a lot of times that could be my perception simply because
we actually went
it avoided the point where you would have a panic factor.
The old air base.
I'll be leaving a lot out as we head up to the time I get to the military here, simply because there's just too much to cover here, but I'm trying to put voice tapes together and trying to recall all that did happen to me. After this event, we moved back to New Boston, Ohio. There, once again, on Stanton, we lived in a duplex that had 2 homes on both sides, and it had 2 apartments upstairs.
You had 4 apartments.
When
2 downstairs,
we
2 upstairs.
moved back there, everything went pretty normal for a couple of months. Then we were playing and it was getting dark. There was Michael Dunham, Larry Stevens, my cousin, Delbert Hudson, and myself. We were playing, it was getting dark. The sun had set, stars was out. Michael Dunham and myself were in the backyard. We were playing Army at that time. We were in my backyard when all of a sudden we looked up over the hill and there's this big bright light. Once again, yellowish in color, coming over the hill. It got to where it was at maybe a 45-degree arc from where we were standing looking up. Then there was this small beam of white light starting to come down from the object. Immediately, the object itself took on a bright white light appearance. And the light would just shoot down a little and go back, shoot down a little and go back, shoot down a little and go back. But it seemed like it was getting closer and closer to us. I then told Mike to go around to the front. My recollection was stopping, looking back at the light, then turning and running down the little area between my house and our neighbor's house, which to me would have only taken a couple seconds. When I got around to the front, I was told by Delbert and Mike that actually 45 minutes or so had passed. What had been a little after 8 right now is a little before 9. And I found that very incomprehensible because all I remembered was looking back at the light. It was still coming closer and then running around to the front. What happened? I don't know. That's the only recollection that I have of the light. The next week or so, still having interaction off and on with these little entities, still talking to my friends about it. They couldn't understand it. They couldn't see them. But then one day while we were playing in the garage that was in back of our house, that was our garage, we turned it into a clubhouse. Some of the entities showed up there. Immediately all the doors and windows were locked. Delbert came over. As he came over, he looked up. For the first time, Deb Hudson now saw an entity, a creature, looking back, looking down at him. Of course, he felt that there was other people there with me and that I might be in danger. So he came and knocked on the door, the front door, and, "Hey, Cliff, open up." And I said, "I can't right now. Go away. I'll come and find you as soon as I take care of some stuff here." He says, "Open up. Who's in there with you?" I says, "No one's in here with me. I've seen them. I know you're not in there alone." And the entity that was there with me was telling me, "You need to tell him to leave." I was being shown some things, some instruments, for lack of a better term, and the capabilities of those instruments. Things that we eventually would get into. Things that we would eventually turn into weapons, and that would not be good for our civilization. I now know some of the things that I saw, not like what they showed me, but like we have developed those very same technologies into weapons. Did we acquire them from them? I don't know. I like to think that we actually, through man's ingenuity, through man's own perseverance, through man's own wisdom and knowledge, he evolved to that level where he was to manipulate those science that he understood, the physics, the physical principles of developing these weapons. I'd like to think that they are for the betterment of mankind, but that isn't necessarily so. But here again, I'm getting ahead of myself again. Deb went and got my mother. My mother came in and told me that, or knocked on the door and insisted I open the door. I told her, "Mom, I can't do it right now. Please just go away." They didn't want to leave. Well, all of a sudden things started, I don't know how to put this, but fade out. Deb came in through the window. And that was kind of interesting because he broke. We had a sink there by the window where he came in from the side, and it broke. And water was flooding all over the place. I was worried about him coming in because I was told, anyone sees too much, we will have to kill them. And I didn't want to see one of my friends die. So there was a 2x4 I picked up and tried to hit at this creature. And it just smiled and said, "Well, you know, we don't really want to hurt no one. And just give us a couple more seconds and we won't be here. It will be like we were never here." Of course, Delbert got in, opened the door. My mom came in, 4 or 5 of the other kids came in. And I couldn't explain to them. And I told Delbert, "I'll tell you later." But Delbert kept insisting, "No, there was a man there. There was a man there." To him, it looked like a man. But these events were to continue throughout my childhood. On the next tape will take place where we moved to Gallia Street from there, which was no longer in Portsmouth, Ohio. Gallia Street continues into was no longer New Boston, Ohio. You go through New Boston, you head into Portsmouth on Gallia Street. then strange events started to take place there.